Well, let's go through the stories of the weekend. I'm going to go through the newspapers with you now. Let's have a look at the front page of the Sunday Telegraph first. Staff can sue their boss if customers offend them. This is about a private member's bill that's been slipped through Parliament, I think on Friday, while no one was looking, that the Telegraph are very upset about. The Sunday Times, new nightmare for patients as strikes return. Yet again, more strikes in the NHS. The Observer, care homes crisis, children sent hundreds of miles away. This is about some children in care being sent up to 300 miles from where they are from. Sunday Mirror, have a laugh at my funeral. This is apparently Paul O'Grady's final words to his best friend. The Sunday Express splashes with, Rishi has 6 months to sort boats crisis. It's on his 5-point pledge plan. And the Mail on Sunday goes with vegan mob plans to sabotage the Grand National. It's about eco-warriors trying to get on the turf for that momentous moment up at Aintree later on this month. The Sun on Sunday, married England ace gags secret lover. Not named, but pictured in silhouette, so that will keep us guessing all day. And the Sunday People, Tories blow 8 million on King Charles pictures, which I believe we're going to be discussing in just a moment. Delighted to be joined now by Nigel Nelson, who's GB News' senior political commentator, newly coined, newly minted. I mean, before that, Nigel, you've spent 36 years covering politics, particularly for the People and the Sunday Mirror, so on the left side of things. And so it's interesting that you've chosen this interview that Sir Keir Starmer has done with the Sunday Times. What's he saying?
Well, the most interesting part about it, he's trying to address the transgender issue, which has been ripping the Labour Party apart.
Yes.
So he declares that 99.9% of women don't have penises,
right,
which was the question which caught him out before. Not quite sure that actually solves his problem at the moment.
No, it's not quite equivocal, is it? I mean, unequivocal, that, is it? 99.9%. Why is this such a sticking point with him? Why can't he just say that women don't have penises? I don't understand it.
Because he also believes in trans rights. So this is where he's got himself into a bit of a pickle. And I think the point he makes about it, which is true, is that the debate's become really toxic. And I think this applies to a lot of issues now, that we've got to a stage where debate becomes somehow paralysed. You're either on one side or the other, and don't brook anything in between. So a bit of that's to do with social media. I think there is still the divisions existing over Brexit, which has actually helped that along. But it is a fair point that what he's saying is, look, we ought to actually be a bit more broad-minded about the whole thing. There are different points of view, but both sides ought to come a bit closer together.
But he's quite weather vanish on this, isn't he? I mean, we had last week him saying that he wanted to put a pause on kind of the Gender Recognition Act stuff and the Scottish stuff. Now Labour are coming out with tweets saying, you know, kind of banging the drum for their pro-trans stance. This is a problem with him because he's a bit difficult to pin down. He kind of stands for everything and nothing. You've been covering the political scene for all these decades, Nigel. How would you compare him to, say, Blair? And indeed, I know when you first started out in your career, you were covering Neil Kinnock a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. And so there is a huge difference between them. What you had with Neil Kinnock was a really charismatic leader. In fair dues to Keir Starmer, he's not that. Tony Blair had an underlying political philosophy which helped him win 3 elections. We don't see that with Keir Starmer. And he hasn't got the extraordinary stardust of Jeremy Corbyn. How Jeremy Corbyn got that, I never understood.
No.
But he very much had that kind of...
I think he might have lost his sparkle in recent days.
He may now, but at the time he was actually treated a bit like a rock star wherever you actually went with him. What you've got with Keir Starmer is someone who's terribly bright, he's very good company, he's competent, awfully cautious. So if you put him up against Rishi Sunak, you're almost choosing between 2 bank managers rather than some kind of political messiah. But maybe those qualities aren't a bad thing in a Prime Minister.
I was discussing this with Stephen and Angela earlier on breakfast. Is it a problem that people look at Starmer and think, well, actually, you're in the top 1% that Angela Rayner keeps on going on about. You're a very privileged lawyer. You had special arrangements for your pension. Why are you pretending to be a man of the people where you're just a kind of North London metropolitan elitist?
I think that when it comes to a prime minister, you can be a rich prime minister and you can be a poor one. That's the great thing about our system, that somebody like Rishi Sunak is a billionaire. I don't blame him for being that, and I don't think it disqualifies him from the job. It's something David Cameron said, why should I be disadvantaged in my career because of my background?
Yes.
So I think the same thing applies to Keir Starmer. You can still be a man of the people, even though you've been a successful man of the people.
Now, let's find out if you're a man of the people, Nigel. Because the Telegraph has identified a number of different political tribes. Hopefully we've got the graphic for this. And basically people are now being kind of put in different kind of categories. Are you a far left activist? Are you a rural righty? And the YouGov polling on this is really interesting because it's basically revealing that quite a lot of your traditional Conservative voters are going where?
They seem to be going to reform,
Right.
which is interesting. So this is actually something done by the left-wing think tank Labour Together, and they've, as you said, have identified all these different groups, and the particular one is the rural right, as they call them. Now these are people who are dyed-in-the-wool Tory voters, now don't feel quite so confident about the Tories, and so reform would be the net beneficiary. Of course, the final beneficiary would be Labour.
Yes.
All that will happen, reform is unlikely to be able to get any seats in the same way that UKIP didn't. So what would happen is you'd split the Tory vote, especially in places like Red Wall or whatever, and Labour would come through the middle.
The trouble for reform is, with the greatest respect to Richard Tice, he isn't Nigel Farage of this parish, and therefore I think if Nigel said he wanted to go across and lead that party again, then the Conservatives would be much more worried. But they should be worried anyway if reform are creeping up to, 8 or 9%?
Yeah, they're going in that direction. And yet the Tories need to be worried. But you're right about somebody like Nigel Farage. I mean, he brought Brexit about. I mean,
Yeah.
it was the major achievement, if you like, of this century politically. So, no, you haven't got a Nigel Farage there. But even he didn't get any MPs elected to Parliament.
Now, speaking of Farage, that then we can segue nicely into the Trump story. I do love the fact that the Mail on Sunday have mocked up what Trump's mugshot might look like.
It's good, isn't it?
The Donald's absolutely delighted with this coverage, isn't he, Nigel?
Yeah, he loves it. I mean, in typical Donald Trump fashion, his supporters are saying, oh, this is going to be the most famous mugshot in world history, which I presume will beat even Hugh Grant's mugshot, which was actually quite popular at the time. We'll have to wait till Tuesday to see how all this plays out. Unfortunately, we're not going to see Donald Trump in handcuffs when he goes into court, but there you go. What it has done, obviously, is given his campaign a huge boost. His rhetoric, which was actually quite muted before this started, is now gearing up and is getting more intense, even a bit more on sort of the violent side.
Yes.
So I think that Donald Trump can't be upset about the fact that this is happening. He probably won't go to jail, but even if he did, he could actually serve his presidency.
He's got £4 million more quid in the coffers since this whole news story broke. We're going to be speaking to Lanny Davis, who is Michael Cohen's lawyer, a little later in the show to bring the viewers up to date and the listeners with the Trump story. Just a quick one on the picture of the weekend. Page 3 of the Mail on Sunday. It's Rufus Sewell as Prince Andrew. It's an uncanny likeness.
It's brilliant. I mean, in Victoria, Rufus Sewell looked like Rufus Sewell.
Yes.
But now you wouldn't recognise him, that he's slightly sort of jowly, he's got a bit of a paunch, but he looks exactly like Prince Andrew. And what Netflix are recreating is that famous walk with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein through Central Park.
The Walk of Shame.
The Walk of Shame, and Rufus Sewell absolutely looks like the person he's playing.
Very quick last final royal story. King Charles. Should the Tories be blowing $8 million on King Charles pictures, Nigel?
Well, probably not. But I mean, what was interesting about this story is we always have pictures of the monarch up in various offices, council offices, government offices. No one's ever thought about who pays for them.
Yes.
Well, we do. And apparently they cost $8 million.
Probably a little bit too much expense at a time
Could well
of
be.
straightened finances. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning, Nigel Nelson.